please take a seat. My subject today is market failure, and I'm going to argue that market failure is both an argument for government intervention in the economy and an argument against government intervention in the economy, because it is both a reason why the free market sometimes does the wrong thing and a reason why the alternative mechanisms for making decisions often do the wrong thing. And I want to start out by explaining what I believe market failure is. That it is commonly why it is an argument against laissez-faire and why it is a stronger argument against the alternative. I'm going to argue that market failure is the exception on the private market and the norm on the political market. I also want to talk about its relevance to lots of things that have nothing to do with politics, but have something to do with your lives. All right? And I'm going to be trying to explain. Let me start by pointing out that in many fields there are technical terms that sound self-explanatory and are not. And my standard example is the theory of relativity. I believe there are many people in the world who think they understand the theory of relativity, except for the mathematical details. That the theory of relativity says everything is relative, and I understand that. And in fact, of course, the theory of relativity does not say everything is relative. Among other things, as any physicists in the audience know, it says that the speed of light is quite impossibly absolute. Similarly, in the case of market failure, it sounds as though it means any situation where markets fail. And I'm going to argue that that's wrong twice over, that there are ways markets could fail that are not market failure, and that market failure happens in a whole lot of contexts that have nothing to do with what we normally call markets. So let me start by telling you what I believe market failure is, what I think is the most useful way of thinking of the concept. And that is that market failure describes a situation where individual rationality does not produce group rationality, where each individual correctly acts in his own interest, and all of us are worse off as a result. And that happens because I am taking an act that helps me but hurts you. You are taking an act that helps you but hurts me. It is not limited to markets. And let me start with my very favorite example. When I give this example in America, I have to require that people imagine they're several thousand miles away, but that's not necessary here. I just want you to shift back about 1,000 years and imagine that you are part of a line of about 10,000 men with spears, and the spears are pointing that direction. And the reason they're pointing that direction is that there are another 10,000 men with spears coming at you on horseback. If you like, you can assume that that you're Harold Godwinson's people and that those are the Bastards' people. And you do a very quick cost-benefit calculation. And you say, if all of us stand and keep our spears planted, with luck we can break their charge. And if we break their charge, some of us will die, but most of us will live. If we run, horses run faster than we do. I should stand. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said we. I don't control him and him. I only control me. If everybody else stands and I run, one person out of 10,000 will have almost no effect on our chance of breaking the charge, and I won't be one of the ones killed doing it. If everybody else runs and I stand, I'm dead. Whatever everyone else is doing, I am better off running. Everybody makes this calculation. We all run, and most of us die. Welcome to the dark side of rationality. All right, that's one example. Let me now give you a much more mundane example, and one which I have experienced and probably you have. I experienced it when I was teaching at UCLA, and just south of UCLA, there is a traffic intersection that the locals claimed at the time was the busiest intersection in the world. It's about 8 or 10 lanes each way. So you have an intersection here, and as the light this way goes red, the last few cars try to get across and end up trapped in the intersection, blocking the cars coming this way. And gradually, the cars here manage to filter out just in time for the cars coming this way to fill the intersection as this light goes red and block it the other way. All right? If everybody politely waited to pull into the intersection until he was sure he could get across it, everybody would get home faster. But any person who did that would get home later, because all of the costs I imposed by shoving across are costs imposed on these people. All of the costs they impose are costs imposed on these people. Hence, each of us is correctly making the decision in his own interest, and we're all worse off as a result. All right? That's my second example. Let me give you a third example, which I am even more confident you have experienced. You are in a restaurant or a pub having a pleasant conversation with your friends. And the only trouble is there are a bunch of other people in this restaurant or pub who are also having conversations. That makes it a little bit hard for you to hear what your friends say and for them to say it. And the only solution to that, obviously, is for you to speak a little bit more loudly. But of course, everybody else observes that they're having the same problem, so they're all speaking more loudly. So the only way you can possibly be heard is if you speak still more loudly. And so you end up with everybody speaking at the top of his voice, most of you getting hoarse, and still having a hard time understanding each other. And as you can see, all three of these stories have the same basic logic. They are all cases where the individual rational behavior does not lead to the group rational behavior. Why is this politically interesting? It's politically interesting because there is a simple argument for freedom, for a laissez-faire system where everybody controls his own life, which unfortunately is wrong. Unfortunately, because I like the conclusion. And the simple argument for freedom is that each person acts in his own interest. Each makes the decision that maximizes his net benefit, benefit minus cost. That maximizes net benefit for everyone, so there is no need for governments to intervene to change what people do. All right, sounds like a sort of a plausible kind of argument, but as we've just seen, what is wrong with it is the situation described by market failure. That sometimes I get the benefit of my act and you get the cost, air pollution, dangerous driving, filling up the intersection. And if so, I might take the action even if total cost, including your cost, is larger than benefit, which makes us on net worse off. And economists call these situations negative externalities. Sometimes I pay the cost and you get the benefit. I make a radio broadcast. I can't control who hears it, so therefore I can't charge for it. Similarly, I do some basic research. I make an important discovery. That information is available to many other people who benefit by it. So in those cases, even if the benefit produced is larger than the cost, it might not pay me to do it. And that misses an opportunity to make us on net better off. This is what economists generally describe as the public good problem. Sometimes there are solutions to these problems, solutions that are dealt with by human ingenuity. So for example, you can have cases where you solve the externality problem by putting both parties in effect together. So consider, for example, a free parking lot. A free parking lot provides benefits for all of the merchants near it because it means their customers can come more easily. Free parking lot has some advantages over a pay parking lot because you don't have to watch and hire people to monitor cars coming in and out. How do you get a free parking lot? Well, somebody builds a shopping center. The firm that builds the shopping center owns the whole thing. They provide a free parking lot, and they charge for it implicitly in the rent that they charge to the stores that are occupying the shopping center. And they can make other calculations based on externalities as well. The people who own the shopping center can say, look, the movie theater would do better if there were a late-night restaurant next to it, so after the movie, people can go to a restaurant. The late-night restaurant would do better if there was a movie theater next to it, so we will arrange to rent one space to a late-night restaurant, one to a movie theater next to each other. And you can think of a whole lot of other ways in which the proprietor of a shopping center can take account of these interactions, of the ways in which what one person in the shopping center does with regard to another, and thus get the optimal result with avoiding a market failure problem. All right? Some public good problems can be dealt with by ingenuity. And my favorite example of that is radio broadcasts. That it's perfectly obvious that you would never get private radio broadcasts because the broadcaster bears the cost of putting on the program, and he can't charge the people who listen to the program because he doesn't know who they are. He can't control who does it. But some unknown genius thought of the idea of producing not one public good but two. One public good has a positive cost of production and a positive value to the consumer, and we call that a radio program. And one public good has a negative cost of production and a negative value to the consumer, and we call that an advertisement. And it has a negative cost of production because a firm will pay the radio station to put on the ad. You tie the two products tightly together and you give away the bundle. And that, in fact, is the way private radio and television are produced. And it's also, in effect, the way a good deal of the internet, the World Wide Web, is produced as well. So that's one case in which you do it by ingenuity. But there's no guarantee you can do that. That is to say, there is no guarantee that anything worth producing will get produced, because there isn't always some trick by which you can solve the problem. And it therefore follows that a government could step in to improve the situation by regulating air pollution and dangerous driving, making us all better off by preventing acts whose costs are larger than their benefits, and improve it by subsidizing radio, television, and basic research, making us all better off by producing acts whose benefits are larger than their cost. But there is a problem here, and the problem is that for this to work, we need to have some way of getting the government to, in fact, do the right things. So we want to think about the government, about the whole set of political actors, from voters all the way to the up or down to the prime minister, as themselves rational actors acting in their own interest, just like people in the private market. And then the question becomes, will the rational choices of those actors add up to rational choices for the whole polity? So we have exactly the same question with regard to the political market that we had with regard to the private market. And if they don't, if it is often in the interest of political actors to take actions whose costs are larger than their benefits, refrain from actions whose benefits are larger than their costs, then the government intervention could make things worse instead of better. And that brings us to the subject of market failure on the political market. Because in fact, if you think about it, most political decisions are made by people who neither pay the cost nor receive the benefit. The voter, who makes himself well-informed in order to know who to vote for, provides benefits mostly to other members of his polity. The legislator who passes a bill is producing both costs and benefits for other people. The lobbyist who gets a bill passed is producing benefits for his customers and will sensibly ignore any costs imposed on people who are not his customers. And the judges who make decisions, who in the Anglo-American system make a good deal of the law by setting precedents, are setting precedents whose costs and benefits are almost entirely borne by other people. It follows that there is no reason to expect political actors to take the actions that maximize net benefit for all. For example, let me go through the ones I just listed in a little more detail, and I want to start with you. I presume that most of you, at least those of you who are British citizens, are voters. And as voters, I expect that most of you are rationally ignorant. It is rational to be ignorant when information costs more than it is worth. Most of us, ignorant sounds like a negative term, but of course most of us are ignorant about most things. I expect most of you, like a student I was talking about earlier, have not read Jesse Byock's wonderful article about Egel-Saga. And there are probably some of you who can't prove the Pythagorean theorem, quite a lot of you who don't understand how Ricardo invented general equilibrium theory without mathematics, and there are a whole lot of things I'm ignorant about too. So it's not irrational to be ignorant if the information is worth less than it costs. Think about what I like to refer to as the civics class model of democracy, or the naive model of democracy. And in that model, the reason democracy works is that if the politicians do the wrong things, we vote them out. All right, that's the sort of simple theory. But information is costly. If my vote has any effect at all, most of the benefit go to other people. So most voters are rationally ignorant. I cannot speak to politics in the UK, but as far as I know, no American politician has ever run for office with the slogan, "I'm the bad guy." No American politician, as far as I know, has ever introduced a bill into Congress whose title is "A Bill to Make Farmers Richer and City Folks Poorer." Now, in fact, we have such a bill every year. It's called the Farm Program. Its basic purpose, through a variety of different mechanisms, is to raise the price of farm products in order to make farmers richer and the rest of us poorer. But a sensible politician will always find some argument to pretend that he's helping everybody. I assume that politicians in England probably say, well, look, what would have happened to England in 1939 if it hadn't been growing enough food? Therefore, we've got to protect English agriculture to make sure that we can produce enough food so that the next time an enemy shows up in a position to put U-boats around our coasts and prevent our transport, we will be able to eat. And American politicians would have a little harder time making that argument, given that we're a large-scale exporter of farm products, but I'm sure they can find some way of doing it. So that means that in order to find out, in order for this naive model to work, the individual voter has to invest a substantial amount of time and energy figuring out what his politician has been doing and what he should be doing. Not trivial, all right? Even suppose you do enough to know that the person you're going to vote for or against voted against a bill you're in favor of. If you went to him, he might say, well, yes, it's true, it was a good bill. Sorry I had to vote against it, but I had to trade that vote for somebody else's vote on an even more important bill. Very hard for you to know if he's telling the truth. Or he might have said, well, I voted it down because although I was in favor of the objective of the bill, I was hoping to get through another and better bill for that objective. Again, it's not easy to know that he's lying. You also have to pay attention to who your representatives are. I have occasionally taught undergraduate classes in California, and when I do that, I sometimes ask my students, essentially all of whom are old enough to vote, if they know the name of their congressional representative, and generally about half of them do. It's very hard to pay attention to how someone is voting if you don't know his name. So the basic argument is that we would expect voters in a democracy to be rationally ignorant of the information they would need to make the democracy work. What's the result of that? That voters support policies that sound good if you don't think about them. To somebody who doesn't know very much, they have no incentive to learn more, and you get a politics of sound bites and demagoguery. And the largest factor probably determining how most people vote is what views their friends are in favor of. Because if all of my friends are Tories and I come out for the Labor Party, my friends are going to think, what kind of idiot am I? And vice versa if my friends are Labor and I'm a Tory. So there's a lot of pressure on people to vote and to persuade themselves whatever views the social circles they mostly believe in, and very little pressure to actually get the right answer. Let me give you another example of market failure on the political market, and that's political time horizons. Think about the question of how you get people to bear costs now for future benefits. Consider, for example, black walnut. Black walnut is a very pretty kind of lumber, but it's a rather slow-growing tree. And let us suppose, I'm not sure if it's correct, that it takes about 40 years for a black walnut tree to get big enough to harvest. And I'm considering buying some land and planting black walnut trees on it. 40 years from now, the value of the trees will be enough to repay the investment. I'm 73 years old. All right, it looks as though it would never pay me to do it. But it would, because 10 years from now, and with any luck I'm still alive, I can sell that land to somebody else. Land with 10-year-old black walnut trees is worth more than land with newly planted black walnut trees. 10 years later, he can sell it to someone else. So in fact, it is in my selfish interest to make investments which pay off past my lifetime. All right. There is, however, a condition for this, and the condition is that I actually get the benefits. Suppose I believe that there's a sizable chance that 20 years from now, when the trees are big enough to be worth something, even though not full-sized, some enterprising person will drive onto my land in a pickup truck with a chainsaw at night and drive off with my black walnut trees. The higher that probability, the higher the payoff of the investment has to be to cover that risk. The same thing is true if I believe that it's possible that sometime in the next 40 years, an enterprising politician will decide that black walnut trees are obviously a national resource and will nationalize my property and my trees. Again, that risk means that I would only make the investment if it had a very high payoff. So the requirement for long-term planning is secure property rights. Politicians do not have secure property rights in their political power. All right? A politician who does politically costly things now that provide a benefit to his successor 20 years later is being foolish in terms of his own interest. The successor has a 50-50 chance of being in the other party. It's not going to be him in any case. So he's going to bear the costs and not receive the political benefits. I gave this talk last year in Brazil, in Rio. And it happened that Rio at that time was having a serious water problem, that it turned out that their water distribution system was not in very good shape. Why is it not in very good shape? Well, 10 or 20 years before, the mayor could have invested money on maintenance and on expanding the system to make sure everybody had enough drinking water. But there were other things you could spend that money on, things that would more directly buy votes, giving more welfare to voters, or giving contracts to companies that would make contributions to his campaign. You can think of lots of ways that one can spend money as a politician that give you short-term advantages. And it would have been foolish of him to spend money on projects which would only turn out to be useful 20 years down the road. So the result is that one would expect politicians to have short time horizons. Now, oddly enough, politicians don't say this. Indeed, politicians routinely claim that they are doing things in a very far-sighted way with long-term benefits. And that's a very sensible thing for them to do because the voters can't see the future. And therefore, you can claim benefits, whether or not you're providing them, in order to explain current problems. And I believe that the champion in this particular endeavor was an enterprising gentleman from the country of Georgia, except it wasn't a country at the time, by the name of Joseph Stalin, that he could not persuade the Russians that they had things well then, because in Moscow, which was the best place in the Soviet Union to be, people were living a family to a room in buildings. They knew they were poor. But he could say to them, yes, we are suffering now. We are all making sacrifices, but we're making sacrifices to build up Russian Soviet industry so that your children will be as rich as the Americans and your grandchildren will be richer than Americans. And for a decade or two, he could get away with that. Eventually, people noticed that they are still as far behind America and Western Europe as they were before, and eventually, fortunately, the Soviet Union collapses, Stalin not being around by that time. But if you look at what politicians actually do, if you even pay careful attention to what they say, not when they're giving campaign speeches, but when they're actually talking about tactics, you discover that what they really want to know is what's the unemployment rate going to be at the next election, what's the inflation rate going to be at the next election, what are the visible measures people care about going to be in the very short term. Rational behavior by them, unfortunate consequences for us. Let me take the case of the regulation of medical drugs. We could also talk about recreational drugs, but not for this particular talk. Think about the incentives on somebody in the FDA in the US, or whatever the equivalent is in the UK, deciding whether or not to approve a new medical drug. He knows that there is always some chance that there will be very serious negative side effects that haven't yet been observed. There's a famous case, real case, of a drug that was given to pregnant women, and the side effect was a very small probability that when their daughters went through puberty, they would suffer a medical problem. All right, that means you'd have to wait 14 or 15 years to find out it was true. You'd have to give the drug to hundreds of thousands of people to get a large enough sample for it to be observed, and you'd have to know what to look for. That particular one, well, Bendectin is what it's called. That's another story. But the point is only that there's always some risk for a medical drug. And suppose you permit a drug and it kills 20 people. Your career is finished. You're the person who made that mistake. Suppose you delay a drug and it kills 100 people. No cost to you at all. Because how does delaying a drug kill 100 people? You have an existing drug with a cure rate of 90%. There is a new drug with a cure rate of 93%. You keep that drug off the market for some years, and 100 people die who otherwise would have lived, but nobody knows who. They're statistical deaths. They are not observable deaths. And my favorite story on this is the press release where the US FDA admitted to killing 100,000 people. They, for some reason, did not put the press release in that form. What they said was that they had decided to approve a beta blocker, a drug used to prevent a second heart attack. Beta blockers had been in use in Europe for, I think, something over a decade at this time, and there had been people arguing that the FDA should approve it. They finally approved it, and they estimated that its use would save 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year. Well, if its use saves 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year, and they kept it out of use for 10 to 12 years, that means that they killed about 100,000 people. But as I say, that's not the way they reported the story. Let me give another example of market failure on the political market, and that's the pattern of redistribution to favor concentrated interest groups at the expense of dispersed interest groups. Right? We want a system where when something produces larger benefits than costs, it happens and otherwise doesn't. But in fact, we see the opposite pattern. And the standard example for an economist is an auto tariff or a steel tariff that economists have known for about 200 years now, since Ricardo published, that a tariff as a general rule hurts the country that imposes it. There are some special exceptions which don't have much to do with what tariffs actually get passed, but it's the right sort of rule of thumb. Nonetheless, almost all countries during that period and still have tariffs. The UK was the great exception in the 19th century. Hong Kong was the great exception in the 20th century. Those were both spectacularly successful economies. Hong Kong more than the UK, of course, since Hong Kong went in, 30 or 40 years from desperate poverty being richer than you are. Real per capita incomes are higher than in the UK. But both of those were successful polities. Nonetheless, nobody seems to want to imitate them. Why? The auto tariff benefits a small number of players, the auto companies and the auto union, and it imposes a cost on consumers and farmers. Consumers, because they're paying a higher price for cars, because there's a tax on importing cars. Farmers, because if you import less, you export less, and the U.S. exports farm products. The way I like to put it is that the U.S. has two technologies for building cars. We can build them in Detroit or we can grow them in Iowa. The way you build cars in Detroit is obvious. The way you grow cars in Iowa is that you grow the raw material cars are made out of, which is called corn. You put it on a ship. You send the ship out into the Pacific, and it comes back with Hondas on it. And that's a technology for producing autos, just like the other one is. And a tariff is a tax on that technology. It's a way of making sure that we will build cars even if it's cheaper to grow cars. What happens politically? The beneficiaries of a tariff face their own public good problem. That if Ford makes political campaign contributions to get a tariff, GM benefits by it. All right, so you have the same problem of how you produce something when the producer can't control who gets it. But a public good with a very small public is not such a hard problem, because if there are only 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 players, it's reasonably simple for them to get together and for Ford to say to GM, look, we'll contribute 10 million if you contribute 15 million, you're bigger than we are, and we'll all do that if the United Auto Workers agree to do various things to get their people to vote for or contribute to or work for the campaigns of public-spirited politicians who support the auto tariff. So a small and concentrated interest group, if the benefit to them from the auto tariff is $10 billion, they can probably raise at least $1 billion to buy the tariff. All right. The victims, their cost could be $100 billion, but there's no way that a public of several 100 million people is going to raise even 1% of the value of stopping the tariff. So that means that even if the tariff imposes costs much larger than the benefits, it is likely to pass, as in fact tariffs quite commonly do pass, because the beneficiaries are a concentrated interest group and the victims are a dispersed interest group. So this tells us that it is, as a rule, politically profitable to benefit concentrated groups at the expense of dispersed groups, even if the cost is much larger than the benefit. What's my conclusion? The conclusion is more or less where I started, that on the ordinary private market, individuals must usually pay for what they use and get paid for what they produce. If you want to build cars, you've got to pay auto workers enough so they're willing to work for you. You've got to pay people who make steel enough so they're willing to produce steel for you and all the rest of it. But It isn't always true. There are occasionally situations where you can impose a cost on somebody without his consent, such as air pollution, and therefore market failure sometimes occurs. On the political market, individuals almost never bear the costs or receive the benefits of their actions. Thus, they have no incentive to make those choices that maximize net benefit for all. Hence, market failure is common. And that explains why market failure does a better job of predicting political outcomes than of predicting market outcomes. That on the private market, it's obvious from market failure theory that radio broadcasts won't be made, and yet they are. Externalities shouldn't be controlled, but often, though not always are. Compare a large shopping mall with the political equivalent of a small town and ask which is typically cleaner and safer. On the public market, the economic argument for protective tariffs is out of date by 200 years. I like to say that reading public discussions of trade policy, I feel as if I was reading a discussion of the moonshot written in terms of Ptolemaic astronomy, where we were worried about whether the Apollo capsule would crash into the crystalline sphere that's carrying the moon around. But nonetheless, we get tariffs because they benefit the concentrated interest group at the cost of the dispersed. As Gary Becker, a fairly prominent economist who died not too long ago, unfortunately, pointed out, farm policy in countries with few farmers is designed to raise crop prices to get the political support of the farmers. That applies to the EU, I think to the UK, and surely to the US. In countries with many farmers, typically much poorer countries, farm policy tends to have the purpose of holding down farm prices in order to buy the support of the urban mob at the expense of the dispersed peasantry. And that's exactly the opposite of the pattern you would expect for the naive model of democracy, whereas if there are lots of people, government pays attention to you, and if there are a few people, it won't. My conclusion then is that market failure is an argument for government intervention in markets, but a stronger argument against, once one remembers to apply the same analysis to both systems, to think of the political system not as benevolent demigods standing up there doing good, but as people just like us, and just like the people in the private market, each of whom has his own objectives and is trying to achieve them as best he can. All right? Enough politics. Let me go on to discuss other reasons why market failure is relevant to other things. And I will start out with my first example, that one way of winning battles is to arrange things so it's in the interest of the other side's soldiers to run. And if they run, you don't have to fight them. And that, of course, suggests the flip side of that. How do you keep it from being in the interest of your soldiers to run? And one way of doing it is a proverb: burning your bridges behind you. You march your army across a bridge. The last few people across destroy the bridge, and you point out to your soldiers that there's nowhere to run to, so they'd better stand and fight. This is a high-risk strategy, but it sometimes works. Another strategy is to try to make the individual soldiers care a whole lot about their buddies, about the people around them, such that they give serious weight to the fact that if they run, they both will look like cowards and will result in killing people they care about. And the classical example of that, some of you may be familiar with, was a military unit in classical antiquity called the Sacred Band of Thebes. And the Sacred Band was made up of pairs of homosexual lovers, no one of whom would ever show cowardice in the presence of his beloved or abandon his beloved to die. And the Sacred Band won every battle they fought until the last, when they encountered a Macedonian army commanded by Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, and they died to a man. That, at least, is the account we have. We don't know for certain if anything from classical antiquity is true, but it's a good story, and I think it illustrates the point of one of the approaches to solving this problem. Similarly, if you're running a firm, part of the firm design is to try to get it as nearly as possible so that the individual people in the firm have incentives compatible with the interests of the firm, which may mean dividing your firm in such a way that you can say, all right, this group of people produce this much money, this group of people produce that much money, therefore we can decide who should be rewarded, who should be fired, and so forth. Let me go on, however, to my own field, since I'm a professor, and discuss what I think of as the silent student problem. that I've just finished explaining something that I've explained 100 times before and could explain in my sleep. And I say to my students, now did everybody follow that? And nobody says anything. So I go on, and only when I grade the final exam do I discover my mistake. What is happening? Each individual student is saying to himself, well, I don't understand it. Possible the other ones do, I don't know. If I say I don't understand it, I'll look stupid to my peers. I don't like looking stupid to the other students around me. I'll look stupid to the professor, who may give me a worse grade eventually when it's all over. So therefore, I'll keep my mouth shut, and maybe somebody else will have a problem. Right? Rational behavior with an unfortunate consequence. I have a solution to this problem. Now, I'm a theorist, so this is only a theoretical solution. I haven't actually implemented it. But it could be implemented. And my solution, there are probably better ways with current technology, but I'll give you the way I originally thought it up. And that is, you arrange your classroom so that at every place there's a button on the floor that a student can unobtrusively push with his toe. And at the back of the hall, there is a sign that shows how many buttons are pushed. So when I come to the relevant point, I say, now, will everybody who clearly understood the principle of comparative advantage please push your button? And the number 2 appears on the sign at the back of the hall, and I go back and explain it again. All right? So these are all cases where market failure is relevant to various things. Let me give you another thing it's relevant to, which is relevant for some of you, and that's how to run a household. As it happens, my wife and I both cook. So sometimes I cook dinner, sometimes she cooks dinner. And one possible arrangement would be that when she cooks, I clean up, and when I cook, she cleans up. And an alternative would be that when she cooks, she cleans up, and when I cook, I clean up. And the question is, which one is a better arrangement? And I'm only interested in opinion from people who cook, because if you're unfamiliar with the technology, you do not have the technical knowledge necessary to answer this question. Which one is better? Anybody want to tell me? Yes?
The first one.
Which is?
I cook, you clean up, and vice versa.
Yeah, I would say the opposite. Do you cook?
Yeah.
All right, huh. And you have no control over how much mess you make when you cook?
That's a good point, but well, it balances out because then the next time the other.
But we aren't talking about equality, we're talking about efficiency. The question is, either way is going to balance out, right? Either way, each of us is doing half the cooking, half the cleaning up. The point is that when I'm cooking, I can make a bunch of decisions that affect how much cleaning up there is to be done. I can decide to do a one-pot meal or to do something that involves a frying pan, a saucepan, and a broiler. I can decide while the water is coming to a boil for the pasta whether to spend the time cleaning up the frying pan that I use to saute the onions in or whatever. There are a bunch of decisions that I can make which will affect how much work there is to be done. Now, it's true I love my wife, but nonetheless, costs to her are less obvious to me than costs to me. And I suspect the same thing is true of her, even though she loves me. And therefore, if we follow the rule we in fact do follow, which is that whoever cooks dinner is responsible for cleaning up that meal, the result is that each of us has an incentive to properly take into account what would otherwise be external costs in doing it. So that at least is my argument. Let me give you another example. I assume that at least a few of you have had children and most of you have been children. So imagine that your child has just made a mess, has just dumped all of the Legos out of the box and onto the floor. And there are two things you could do. You could clean up the mess yourself, or you could get your child to clean up the mess. Probably getting your 3-year-old to clean up the mess is more work than cleaning it up yourself. Nonetheless, it would probably be prudent for you to get the kid to clean up the mess because they then has an incentive not to make a similar mess again. Finally, think about a market failure as a profit opportunity. Market failure implies that there is some other outcome from what you did that is on net an improvement. So an entrepreneur who figures out how to get that outcome might end up with some of the gain. For example, the first person to think of combining advertisements with radio or TV broadcasts. The first developer of a shopping center. Or a company that gave away for free the use of a search engine online in order to find things on the web and charged companies for being easy to find, which was Google's business model, which made them, I think by now, several $billion. All right? Finally, I want to go to the idea of designing around market failure. And I will do this with a story. Fictional story, I'm afraid, this time. Two Bedouins are riding their camels through the desert, a couple of miles on from the oasis, and one of them starts complaining about his camel. This snail I am riding, disguised as a camel, has got to be the slowest beast in all the deserts of Arabia. And the other Bedouin says, you think your camel is slow? This rock I'm sitting on has got to be even slower than your camel. And they get into an argument about whose camel is slower. And they finally agree on a bet that whichever Bedouin's camel gets to the oasis last, his owner wins the bet, and the other one must pay him a golden dinar. Well, you can think pretty easily what's going to happen. That the first camel goes slowly, the second goes more slowly because he wants to win the bet, the second goes more slowly still. And an hour later, there are two Bedouins sitting their camels stock still in the blazing sun in the middle of the desert of Arabia with the oasis still a mile away. At this point, a wise man comes walking along, and he says, why are you two idiots sitting your camels stock still in the blazing sun in the middle of the deserts of Arabia with the oasis a mile away? And the two Bedouins get off their camels to explain the problem. And the wise man says two words, at which point the Bedouins jump on the camels and ride off to the oasis as fast as ever they can. What are the two words? All right. Each one is riding the other one's camel and therefore wants it to go as fast as possible rather than as slow as possible. So that's a nice example of engineering around market failure. If you want more stuff, my website is www.daviddfriedman.com. I gather that the internet connection in this room is not very good, otherwise I would show it to you. My blog, that shows you what the blog is, but it's sufficient to find the website because I've got a link to the blog at the top of the website. The website has on it the full text of, I suppose, 3 or 4 or 5 of my books, the full text of most of my academic articles and most of my popular articles, about 300 medieval recipes, because cooking from very old cookbooks is a hobby of mine and my wife and daughter, some poetry, a good deal of other stuff, lots and lots of stuff. The web is a rather clumsy technology for selling information, but an absolutely beautiful technology for giving information away. So the real trick of exploiting the web is figuring out ways of getting what you want by giving information away. So that I, for example, get people to pay the cost of my coming to Europe and giving talks and get a chance to explore various interesting cities. This is the 8th city I've been in on this trip, by giving away lots of information on my webpage. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us and for giving a talk. I'll ask a couple of questions before opening up to the audience, if that's all right. So you started off your career actually studying to be a physicist. Could you talk about why you decided to go into teaching law and economics instead, and what the transition was like?
Sure. The reason I went into physics was that I did not want to spend my entire life being introduced as my father's son, and my father was a very prominent economist. And I eventually concluded that I was a better economist than a physicist, since I was doing economics as a hobby and physics as a profession at the time, and that I therefore bit the bullet and switched fields. So that would be the simple answer.
Perfect. All right. So the conclusion of on market failure today was that there are stronger arguments against, and you described yourself as a theorist. But given that, in many industries there is already government regulation set in place, how do you think we can actually go about deregulating and privatizing?
That is, you can deregulate by removing regulations. That's sort of.
But for instance, for
obvious.
something like the legal system, which you've argued.
That's a much. Everything I've said so far could have been the views of a pro-free market economist. I'm in fact an anarchist. Okay. So I would want to carry these arguments all the way to replacing everything government does with private arrangements, and not just going back to sort of a 19th century laissez-faire system. That's a much harder project, and I think it's not going to happen rapidly. But if one of the things on my website is a link to the 2nd edition of my first book, part 3 of that sketches what a society might look like in which making laws and protecting rights had all become private activities. So what I'm describing there is a system where each individual is the customer of a firm that sells him the service of protecting his rights and settling his disputes. Every pair of such firms recognizes that violent conflict is very expensive and that there are potentially going to be conflicts between their customers. So each pair of firms agrees in advance to a private court, an arbitration agency that will settle disputes between them. Now, that agreement can't be enforced by any government because there is no government in what I'm describing. But what enforces that agreement is the fact that they're repeat players, that each firm knows that if, when the court rules against their customer, they refuse to go along, then the other one won't go along when it rules the other way. That then gets them into having their employees shoot at each other. That makes it really hard and expensive to hire employees, and your customers don't really like having their front yards turned into free fire zones, so therefore the firms are better off settling it peacefully by arbitration. And then the laws are ultimately being made by the arbitration agencies, which are trying to set up legal rules and procedures that the rights enforcement agencies will want to buy, and the rights enforcement agencies are trying to buy legal rules and procedures that their customers will want to buy in order that they can get people to buy the services from them instead of a competitor. That's a very short version. The third edition of the book, which you can get for, I think, $3.90 as a Kindle at the moment, or is about $10 as a print-on-demand book from Amazon, has got some expansions of the arguments and more analysis of the economics of that system. But that's the sort of short and simple version. So for economists in the room, my claim is that will tend to produce economically efficient legal rules in the normal sense of economically efficient, maximizing. For philosophers, economic efficiency, though people don't usually put it that way, means maximum utility, where interpersonal utility comparison is done as if the marginal utility of income was the same for everybody. And this, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't Alfred Marshall at Oxford, or was he at Cambridge? Cambridge, all right, because that's basically economic efficiency is really coming out of Alfred Marshall's idea of economic improvement, but modern textbooks mess it up because they're trying to pretend they're not doing interpersonal comparisons, so they bring in all of this Pareto nonsense, which is a way of pretending not to do interpersonal comparisons when you're really doing them. And I prefer to bite the bullet and follow Marshall instead.
Perfect. Now's a good time to open up to the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to reach you. And please stand up when you ask your question. And we'll start with the second round.
Thank you very much, Professor. I loved your presentation, so thank you for it. My name is Joshua. A question with regards to climate change. You mentioned Stalin, sacrifice now for your children's benefit. Something like President Trump exiting the Paris Climate Accord. Is that because the costs in the short term outweigh the benefits in the long term? I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I assume that whatever President Trump does, he is doing it because it believes it will get him status, increased chance of winning the next election, and so forth. I doubt very much that he gives heavy weight to the welfare of people 100 years from now. But no, climate change is an interesting case in two different senses. One of the talks I sometimes give is on climate change and population, because I really got into this controversy about 40 years ago when the issue was overpopulation that was supposed to be killing us all. And my view on both of those is that you have both positive and negative external effects, that they are quite uncertain in size, and therefore we do not actually know if climate change is going to make us better or worse off. That if you start out being sure it'll make us worse off, you only look at the negative effects and you say, aha, it makes us worse off, and you can get the opposite result the other way. But the question in terms of the discussion today is not whether climate change is good or bad, but why do governments act as they do? And I think the answer is that the governments act, as in my example of Stalin, in terms of what story they can sell to the voters, that the U.S. government would like excuses to give money to people who support the right politicians, and I presume the UK government would like as well. If you can say to people, we've got to promote solar power or wind power or something like that in order to prevent catastrophic climate change. That's why I'm taxing you in order to subsidize these nice people who are doing that. That gives you a useful excuse to do something you'd like to do. My standard example on this is the largest single climate change policy that the U.S. government has, and that's biofuels. The U.S. currently is turning about a third of its corn crop, maize for those of you who use corn in the Old English sense, into alcohol. The current view of people who are experts in the field is this does not in fact reduce total CO2, that once you take account of the amount of CO2 produced in producing the maize and in transporting it around, it's roughly a wash. Why does it do this? Because it drives up the price of a major crop and therefore buys votes from farmers. And in fact, an American politician who has been very prominent in his concern with climate change actually admitted in public that part of the reason he originally came out from biofuels was he was trying to get nominated for president, and Iowa has primaries very early in the primary season. And I should say this policy, aside from having no effect on climate change, is probably the largest contribution of the U.S. government to world hunger and world poverty, because the U.S. is the largest producer of maize. The amount of maize we're taking off the market is probably somewhere around 15% of the world's supply, and that means that an important food product is scarcer and more expensive for people who consume it. So that's a fairly clear example, I think, where you have a policy justified initially on the grounds that we've got to save the world 100 years from now, but in fact driven entirely by political forces. But if people want, maybe after this people want to talk about climate change, because I've been in that argument for a long time, and I think it is clear that there are large positive effects that tend to get ignored, as well as large negative effects. And I first got into this on population a very long time ago, when population, for those of you who are from some of the older people here may remember, when population had essentially the same status in the public discourse that climate change does now, that sort of we were being told that all the experts knew that increasing population was going to doom us. You had somebody seriously claiming that in the 1970s there would be unstoppable mass famines killing hundreds of millions of people, and all we could do was to decide which hundreds of millions would die. And it didn't happen. What actually happened was the exact opposite of the prediction, that poor countries' calories per capita went up instead of down. But we're getting the same pattern again with climate change for, I think, many of the same reasons.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So now on to the next question. We'll go to the front row in the red.
Hi, so thank you very much for your talk. It was fascinating about some of the problems we do have. But I would just like to bring back to sort of the rational voter thing being sort of the key to some of this. Sure. You argue that basically everyone will be rational and act in their own interests, but I sort of disagree with that. I think that people will be illogical, people will be working for other people. There are people out there who are willing to work despite their own costs, despite their own pain. And in terms of how that relates to government, I think instead of perhaps just scrapping it all together, would accountability not be better? Would opening up government and opening up everything and the way that decisions are made be a far better way of regulating all these rational free market failures as well as the illogical ones?
Yeah. There are certainly variations of what individuals want to maximize. And there are some people, I think most people give weight to the welfare of those immediately around them, that I care a lot about my wife and my children. I care a good deal about my friends. I care somewhat about other people I don't know. I think very few people give anything like as heavy weight to the welfare of random strangers as to the welfare of themselves and those close to them. If you think about it at the political system level, though, consider two people, one of whom is actually concerned with the welfare of, say, everybody in Britain, and one of whom is actually concerned with winning elections. Which of them do you think is more likely to end up in power?
It all depends on what they say. I mean,
if the one who wants to win elections can always say anything that the first guy could say that works, that people will believe, the other guy can say too. But he has the advantage that he can also say things that sound believable and aren't true, whereas the first guy can't. So going back to the voter, I don't see how you're going to open things up in such a way that the people generating the information have no control over what information is being generated, and in such a way that it is cheap and easy for the individual voter to find out what is or is not true. And I think if you look at the behavior of voters, that lots of people would like to think of themselves as well-informed and idealistic. And it's really odd how all of these well-informed and idealistic people, just about half of them end up believing X is good and half of them believe X is bad. And sort of not the result you usually get in science where people are trying to discover things. So I think you ought to think through a little more carefully how you make things open in such a way that you change the incentive structure that I've described, both for the voters and for the politicians.
Perfect. On to the next question. So we'll go to actually the hand all the way on the back.
Let the last be first.
So with the Lego example of making your 3-year-old clean up, so that could disincentivize the 3-year-old to play with Lego and instead play with something easier like a doll or something like that, whereas Lego might have. So there's a difficulty with finding out what the actual incentives are. Are there any solutions for that, or is it inherently difficult to or impossible to fully kind of understand what the incentives actually are?
I guess my general view is that the right way to do child rearing is as much as possible to let the children make the decisions themselves, so that now you can't do that perfectly, it's certainly not with a 3-year-old, but not much past the 3-year-old, I'm willing to accept the idea that they get to decide, do I want to combine the costs and the benefits of doing this? One of our rules when we had kids was that our children did not have to eat what we were making for dinner, provided that the child could find himself something that was no extra work for us and was nutritionally adequate. So that our son ate a good deal of fruit-flavored yogurt, which is no work to prepare and is reasonably good for you, and we had it in the refrigerator. And our children were unschooled, meaning that rather than having this is what you're learning this week, we encouraged them to get interested in things, we tried to help them with what they're interested in, but we did not say, this is the homework you have to do, this is the book you have to read, or whatever. Now that's less true for a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, but even at that level, I think kids are to some extent rational and to some extent know their own interests. I should say, let me quote Adam Smith for a moment, since we're in Britain. Now, Adam Smith, I should say, was not a fan of this university, to put it mildly. I think his comment was that the public professors here had given up even the pretense of teaching. But Smith comments about the discipline in schools being designed entirely for the convenience of the teachers and not the welfare of the students, that students are compelled to attend lectures and then forbidden even to express their disapproval in various ways. And he goes on to say that in the case of children or young boys, some compulsion may be required in order to obtain the rudiments of education, but beyond the age of 11 or 12, compulsion need make no part of education. No compulsion is required to make people attend those lectures that are worth the attending, as is known where such lectures are given. Just a wonderful passage of The Wealth of Nations.
So I agree entirely. I'm actually from the Taking Children Seriously movement, which is very much like that. But what I was wondering more is the difficulty in understanding what the incentives actually are.
Yeah. Well, I think you can see the incentives. The kids don't like to clean up messes generally, and the real question you're asking is whether there is a benefit to the kid due to playing with Legos, which he is not allowing for and therefore won't compensate the inconvenience to him of cleaning up it that you should. And I could imagine such cases. Certainly parents are willing to bear sizable costs for their kids, but I still think that the right rule of thumb is to teach them the lesson when you make a mess you have to clean it up, because that's a very valuable lesson for people to learn.
Perfect, thank you. We'll go to the gentleman in the back.
Hello, I understand you don't want to be introduced in light of your father, but I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us a critique of your father's work, because from my understanding, you seem to have moved away from the neoliberal philosophy, and I was wondering if if you could share your thoughts of your father's work, perhaps.
Well, I would say that most of his work I'm not competent to critique because I haven't worked in macroeconomics at all. I guess the only significant disagreement is that his view was that the stateless society that I described might work but probably wouldn't, and my view was that it might not work but probably would. And that's not the kind of thing where you can do a clean argument to prove one of us is right or one of them is wrong. It's really a judgment call for both of us. I discuss, in the third edition of my first book, I discuss forms of market failure on the market for law, ways in which my system won't give you the right answer, of which there clearly are some. And I discuss reasons why my system might be unstable. In particular, it's the two vulnerabilities of the stateless system I describe. One of them is to foreign states invading, because national defense is a public good, and the other is to cartelization of the rights enforcement agency, that it's possible that the private firms enforcing rights will decide that robbery is more profitable than business and reinvent the government. And I discuss what circumstances will make those things more or less likely. And I think his judgment on that was more pessimistic than mine. But other than that, I don't think, as I say, there are views he had that I'm not competent to discuss, but in general, I think I agreed with most of his views insofar as I understood them.
Great. We have time for one more question, so we'll go to the front row.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have two questions, if that's okay. So, first of all, on the point of tariff, what do you think about the infant industry argument? So you talked about the success of Victorian England as well as Hong Kong in the 20th century. But what about the success of countries like South Korea or Taiwan, which protected their industries when they were in their early stages of development? Because I think comparative advantage could change over time between different countries. I think that's a very interesting argument. And second of all, because I'm a kind of libertarian myself, and as an anarcho-capitalist, do you have any moral arguments against the existence of the state, as well as the utilitarian considerations?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
On your first one, as I think I said, one can imagine circumstances where a tariff would produce benefits. Generally, those are not the circumstances where you get tariffs, because generally infant industries don't have much political effort, and what you tend to get are senile industries, like the U.S. steel industry, having the political muscle to get tariffs. The Hong Kong, without tariffs, did better than Taiwan or South Korea. I don't know enough about Taiwan or South Korea to be able to say how significant whatever protective tariffs they had were. My impression is that quite often, if you look at the countries as they developed, the thing the government was pushing was not the thing they were good at. That India was subsidizing its auto industry at a point when they could have bought secondhand autos very cheaply from the US and Europe. Instead, they were too poor to use secondhand autos, so they had to build very expensive new autos. So I just think that if you look at the developing world in general, that the pattern is usually that the intervention made things worse rather than better. On the other question, I think the moral argument for anarcho-capitalism for libertarians is very easy. The trouble is that if you follow out that moral argument consistently, you get conclusions nobody really believes in. That is, that the moral argument is that you shouldn't initiate coercion, basically. And my favorite sort of counter to that, Bill Bradford was the editor of Liberty magazine. He died, unfortunately. He was a wonderful person. But he, at some point, had a list of sort of problems for libertarians. And one of them is that you're on the balcony of your apartment on the 15th floor of an apartment building, and you somehow carelessly fall out. Fortunately, there's a flagpole on the 14th floor that you catch onto, and you're about to make your way hand over this fortunately very strong flagpole to get onto the terrace when the owner of that apartment comes out and says, "I'm not giving you permission to use my flagpole on my terrace. Please let go." And I think Bill correctly believed that very few libertarians would let go, and yet that seems to be what their principles require. So similarly, it seems to me that there are real moral problems with taxation and conscription and a bunch of other things. But if you were persuaded that without those things, catastrophes would occur, If you really believed that if you didn't have taxation and conscription, you would be conquered by a brutal and oppressive government, you might decide you're willing to put up with that after all. That I would point out that Ludwig von Mises, who a lot of libertarians are fond of, wrote in at least one edition of Human Action that those who in these days oppose conscription are the enemies of freedom. Because under those circumstances, he could believe that. Now, he was also in favor of public subsidies to opera, but this may have to do with the fact that he was an Austrian.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking David Friedman.